Well, Priya, I am so glad that we are having this conversation together. And for all of those who are listening today, I'm speaking. This is Vivek Murthy. I have the privilege of serving as the Surgeon General of the United States, and I have the great privilege of being in conversation today with Priya Parker, who has done so much in her life. But the themes that I have constantly picked out, from everything I read that she's written and everything she's said, is just a tremendous expertise around how we gather, how we resolve conflict, how we exist as a community. And I think these are especially important during the time of this pandemic when we're trying to figure out how to reorient and how to rebuild our connection to others, and in many cases to ourselves. Priya also has a wonderful book called The Art of Gathering, which I've read. Certainly recommend anyone else to read as well. It's a fantastic book that really examines how we can gather more effectively and build community. So Priya, thanks so much for being here for this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And it's a real treat for me to be in conversation with you, somebody who I think well before the pandemic began to argue and use your positional authority to connect social connection and loneliness to public health pandemic, and really elevate the conversation from something that is a nice to have to something that's fundamentally the kind of the social underpinning of our society. And so it's really a treat to be in conversation with you today.
Well, thank you so much, Priya, for that. I appreciate it. And I think that today's conversation is so timely because when I talk to people across the country, whether they're kids in school, whether they're college students, whether they're people who are retired or folks who are in the midst of their busy work lives, I hear questions often about what this moment means, about what it means now, but also how will it affect our lives in the months and years after the pandemic. And I was wondering if we could start there, Priya. I'd be curious to get your sense as somebody who's thought so much about community and connection. How do you make sense of this moment that we're in and the implications it has for how we connect with one another?
I think that we are individually, in small groups, and collectively at a moment of rethinking and resetting. And I'm not the only person to think that or to say that. But in many ways, before the pandemic hit, gathering was something that we took for granted. We were allowed to do. We were doing all of the time, often quite poorly. Whether it's being in meetings, texting under the table, or kind of not really paying attention in person, or over the phone, or at family reunions, or in our public square. Well before the pandemic, the ways in which many of us were coming together were broken. And yet we didn't have, in a sense, enough time, political will, focus, space to begin to actually look at how we structure our time individually and collectively. And I think what the pandemic has done for so many of us, has forced, is beginning to actually see the way we spend our time is chosen, it's invented, it's designed. And over the course of 14 or 16 months, when we haven't actually been able to gather in the ways that we were used to, we had to pause and actually ask, well, who do I want to come together with? When do I want to actually reach through that screen and I'm so deeply frustrated that I can't be with my colleagues? When am I willing to use my body to go into the streets and actually demand for a more just society? And I think so much of what we've been through is this collective and very forced and scary pause to begin to look and to ask, how should we spend our collective time?
And Priya, actually, let me pick up on that piece, because this pause that you mentioned, I think is really interesting, because pauses are really powerful. They could either be an opportunity for a reset, or they could mean we go back to just what was happening before the pause, right? What do you think is actually going to happen? And what do you think will make the difference? And whether we just go back to 2019 or whether we build something perhaps better, even more effective in terms of connection and community during and after this pandemic?
That's like the, $1 trillion question. I think that, I'm a conflict resolution facilitator. And in my work, for groups, and in my work, moments of transition are both the biggest moments of opportunity as well as the biggest moments of risk for any group. And groups that are able to basically look at what has happened, the process through which they went, the reckoning, the moment, and actually create time to reflect on it, to name it, to process it, to grieve it, to celebrate it, to actually just see it and not just rush through and be on autopilot, are the ones that actually have the possibility for some amount of change. And I think similarly when in our workplaces right now, so many organizations and companies are thinking about, do we go back, which I think is the wrong question to your point. Do people regather in the offices? Do you, very practically, do you go back to work 5 days a week versus does everything go virtual versus do you do something hybrid? Is actually asking the wrong question. I mean, the questions that groups that are able to actually change are, what did we go through? What are we ready to discard? What do we actually love and celebrate? What did we secretly long for during this time? And what might we actually invent? And so I think you're a civil servant, and this is as true in our government, in the bills that are currently being debated, which is what have we actually learned and how do we agitate to create the infrastructure so that we can actually transform through this moment rather than just going back to something that wasn't working, before. I'm curious to kind of turn the tables a little bit. I was, as I've watched and just so deeply benefited from your work, you were calling for us to look at loneliness as a public health issue well before the pandemic hit. You as a doctor diagnosed loneliness as a pre-existing condition. And I'm curious, all the way back, I don't know, 2017, 16, 15, before this actually has become even more acute, how did you begin to see that and make the link between loneliness as an individual experience versus something that's a public and collective risk?
Well, Priya, it happened because of the people that I met all across the country when I was Surgeon General during the Obama administration. And I began my tenure then just traveling the country and on a listening tour and asking people really a very basic question, which is, how can I help? And I tried to shut up as much as possible and listen to what they had to say. And one of the things that I heard unexpectedly during those travels, the big cities, small towns all across America, were these stories of isolation and loneliness. And they didn't often come across directly. So people wouldn't say, my name is Priya, my name is Vivek, I'm lonely. But they would say things like, I've got all these challenges I've got to deal with in my life, but I've got to deal with them by myself. Or they would say, I walk through life feeling invisible, like nobody really cares. Or if I disappeared tomorrow, nobody would even notice. And what struck me is that, we have this caricature of loneliness, Priya, which is that we think of it as maybe an older person toward the end of their life living alone in a home. Or we think about somebody who's painfully shy in the corner of a room at a party, not talking to anybody. But that loneliness actually doesn't often look like that. Loneliness, I realize, can present as a college student who seems fairly extroverted, is going to parties all the time, but really doesn't feel connected to anyone and doesn't feel like anybody really knows them. And so I was hearing this from many, many different people across the country. And two things that became really sort of relevant here is that, one, it connected back to my own personal experiences, struggling with loneliness as a child for much of my time in elementary school, and then in a number of points, actually, as an adult, and also connected with my experiences as a doctor, caring for patients over the years, and realizing that in addition to coming in for diabetes and for heart attacks and infections and cancer treatment, that there was often loneliness lurking in the back, of their stories, and it would come out often. I still very distinctly remember scenarios where we would have a very difficult diagnosis to give a patient a new diagnosis. And I would ask them, is there anybody you want me to call to be here so that we can have this conversation together? A family member, a friend. And so often they would say, I wish there was, but there's nobody. So I'll just have the conversation by myself. Even at the time of death, Priya, there were many patients whom I had the privilege to sit next to and to hold their hand and be with them in those final hours of life. And what pained me was how many of those patients experience those final moments alone as well, with nobody but the hospital staff to be with them. So the final thing that struck me, though, Priya, was the consequences of this loneliness for our health, for our physical health and our mental health. And this is the part that was striking to me and that I found ended up being striking to the public, which is that most people just thought about loneliness as a bad feeling. What I came to see is that there was a growing body of research associating loneliness with a higher risk of premature death, a higher risk of heart disease, depression, anxiety, sleep disturbances, and the list goes on. And so when you get into the science of it, there are actually reasons why there are those health impacts of loneliness, but all of it helped me realize that there was a deeper challenge that we were facing here in the country, because there were more people struggling with loneliness than had diabetes in the United States, yet you wouldn't know it from the public conversation about loneliness.
You know, what's interesting to me as I listen to you is you wear these dual hats, both as doctor or physician, that many doctors and first responders have this data within their own hospitals or within their own care practices. And then you also have this role as, Surgeon General, where you are seeing, because you're going out into the country, that this is not only in Brooklyn, this is not only in Toledo, this is not only in Sacramento, this is not only in Miami, and being able to actually see that what often we think of as an individual fault, right? Why am I so alone? Why am I so lonely? Why do I actually feel so apart from my community is actually a collective and national, tragedy. As you begin to, if you were to prescribe a good bill of health, or write a prescription to our nation right now, to begin to collectively face and cure this loneliness, what would be on that chit or that bill?
Well, Priya, it's two things I'd say. One is that you're speaking to this sense of shame that accompanies loneliness, which I think is so powerful. And I use that word shame intentionally because that's how it feels to so many people when they experience loneliness. It feels like something's wrong with them. They're socially deficient, that they're a loser in some way, not recognizing that so many people are struggling with the same, but also that experiencing loneliness from time to time is actually a normal part of the human experience. But in the extroverted world in which we live, we're made to feel like something's wrong with us if we struggle with loneliness. I also think that this moment has forced us into a reckoning around, are we individuals, 330 million individuals who live together, or who just happen to live next to one another, or are we truly an interdependent community that recognizes that we depend on each other for our collective well-being, and we go farther when we recognize those collective needs and support one another. And we have to figure out what to do with that reckoning. That's a value choice about which way we go. But when I think about the prescription broadly, there's a lot of structural things we could point to that I think have made it more challenging for communities to build. There are a lot of cultural elements, around what we value in terms of collective versus the individual, but also what we teach our children about what constitutes success and meaning in their lives. Like, how often do we teach our children that success is actually building meaningful friendships and community? And not that we don't want that for our kids, but where is it on our list of priorities? How often do we talk about it, invest in it as a country? We don't gauge success by the community we create or the relationships we build. We often gauge success by tangible financial output or by promotions secured or papers published or books authored, right? And so I think a lot of this goes to a much deeper, fundamental cultural question and values question of where do relationships fit in our value system, and then should they be reflected in our actions, in our policies, and in how we design institutions, including workplaces and schools. But finally, the prescription in some ways, though, if I had to boil it down to one thing, it's actually fairly simple, which is that we need more love in the world, Priya. Love for one another, love for the people we know, but for the people we don't know, which is sometimes one of the hardest things to do. The people who are not like us, who may have different experiences, but who are bound together by the shared experience of being human. And a key thing that we need more love for is love for ourselves. So many people beat themselves up, in life, especially during this pandemic, feeling like they're not good enough, either because they're somehow not as productive as they were before the pandemic, or because they do experience moments of anxiety or depression, like many people have experienced during this pandemic. But all of that beating ourselves up, I think, actually doesn't always help us. And this is a big counter to the culture that, some of us grew up in, where we were told the harder we are on ourselves, the more we're going to push ourselves to be better. So it's not that we shouldn't hold ourselves to high standards, but I think there's a lot of shame and blame that we direct toward ourselves, which I think ultimately harms us in the long run.
As I listened to you, I'm reminded a little bit of the story Elizabeth Warren sometimes shares, where she, as she began to basically research bankruptcy and understand, people's credit card debt, and begin to interview thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were feeling shame and blame because they had to declare bankruptcy or they were in such debt. She began to see that it's not just individual values or moral values, it's actually a collective system. And you actually need infrastructure like a, credit bureau protection agency to begin to protect people from the system, from credit card companies in that context. And I think part of what the pandemic has highlighted even more is that, at some level, self-care as an idea is actually a symptom of a lack of institutional care, right? We are blaming ourselves individually and think that we can kind of like think and love ourselves out of a system that actually isn't designed for things like, childcare, family parental leave, right? So part of loneliness and part of lack of interdependence is that I was speaking with the writer Anne Helen Peterson a few months ago. She gave this example of like 30 years ago, if there was a apartment building, there was some amount of at least cooperation in terms of something as simple as babysitting, where everybody would, share the same babysitter, and you have communal infrastructure through cooperatives. And now in a building, in part because of the way work is structured, in part because of a lack of things like parental leave or universal pre-K, you have 30 babysitters in 30 units, right? It's become even more individuated. And some of the ways that we actually think about our pooling our collective resources is a symptom of what both the jobs that we either have or don't have, but also what we think, whose responsibility we assume it is. And so I think I hope what comes out of this pandemic, and I hope what comes out of this administration, and I know we still have a second kind of infrastructure, the second part of the infrastructure bills that to hopefully pass, is to actually look at our systems and say, this is not just an individual problem to think about reaching out to the people that you love. This is actually a work problem and how much people are required to work. This is a resources problem. This is a health problem. This is a family paid leave problem. And I think the individualistic society that we are tends to fault the individual, when so much of what our collective loneliness is a result of both broken systems and frankly lack of free time to even do something like join an association, sort of in the Robert Putnam mode. And so I think that a lot of these problems are collective and structural, and we individually, I wrote this book, The Art of Gathering, in part because I think that we are also not trained to gather well. And we are not, as our institutions and trusted institutions have declined, and our like high priests, both literally and metaphorically, are no longer the epicenters of the community to be able to create meaning. Like the democratization of meaning making, right, has increased. We each have to gather our people now. And we need to think about how we need to learn how to do it better. But it's also because our systems are crumbling.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point you make, Priya. This powerful interplay between our values and the structures in which we live, right? And our structures, in many ways, reflect our values, and our values can inform and drive our structures. And this is where I think we have some real rethinking to do. Like, my worry is if you pass a series of laws that put structures in place that can help people, but fundamentally individuals in society don't feel that they have a responsibility to one another, that they are truly invested in the outcome of other people who are not like them, who may not have as much money as them or privilege as them, et cetera, then I worry about the long-term sustainability of those structures, right? But on the other hand, if you have values that don't translate through to our policies and practices, then the benefit, of the collective and those collective values does not manifest, and we don't lift all boats. And so that's, I find, like, what's really interesting about this moment that we're in, because the pandemic, as much as a crisis as it has been, I think does give us the opportunity to rethink this tension between the individual and the collective. Because if it's made anything clear, it's that you can't get through a pandemic just by working hard on your own, right? Absolutely. This is something where we truly, really do depend on one another.
And I think the rise also of public spaces. So if there's an in-between between the individual and then these large systems, things like parks, right? Public libraries are public gathering places, and the infrastructure and the resources put into them versus the privatization of, even the bookstore or private parks. And so even in the pandemic, I live in a city. So much of the few places one could actually go when the weather was decent is the park. And I think and part of the use of public space and where we deem, some of this can also be designed for, right? When we design and put resources into public parks that people want to go and spend to, then there's a bit of a nudge to go and take your children and bump into other people that you may or may not know, and be with people who are unlike you and doing different activities and visibly seeing that there's many ways to be, versus going to that private club and spending your Saturdays going and spending time in a privatized way. And so again, I think that there's individual choices, but also the ways that city and state and national governments decide to fund social infrastructure affects individual values as well. It's really both.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I don't think people have recognized how powerful those public spaces are. We know that, having green spaces, for example, or close to you is associated with a very positive impact on your health, social health, and, your overall physical health. So this is really important. I know our time together is drawing to a close. I could talk to you forever, and I'd love to pick your brain on so much. But one of the things I was really struck by, Priya, when I read your book a while ago, was just how chock full it was of really wonderful, practical, actionable tips for people who are looking to design gatherings more effectively. And I was wondering if, the last few minutes that we have here, if you could share with folks out there who might be thinking about their reentry, who might be responsible for a group at work or at school, or even their family, helping them readjust to this new normal, if you will, that we're in. What tips would you give them? Recognizing that obviously just forgetting that everything has happened and just asking people to go back to the way things were is not the right way to do it. But how can they help people adjust to the moment that we're in?
The way that I've been kind of framing it is to have people, it was sort of going back to our earlier conversation, in that moment of pause, asking, first of all, pausing, like creating a collective pause and not just rushing through it and pretending that everything's, normal again, whatever that is. And instead of asking the question, like, should we go back, or do you want to come back? That's the wrong question to ask. And to instead ask these 4 questions. The first, which is, what did you long for when we couldn't be together? Right? Whether you're faculty or teaching staff or educators in a school, when were the moments where you're just so frustrated, trying to reach through the screen? What did you long for? And actually ask people that and notice, like, oh, because it builds their memory of, oh, there's reasons to come back. There's there's ways I couldn't just grab somebody for a coffee or walk down the hall in an informal way. The second, what didn't you miss? What are you ready to discard? The third, what did we invent during this time that was really interesting? And then the fourth, what do you want to invent now? And maybe I'll close on this example. I this past August, I did this series called The Gathering Makeover, where every week I would speak with a different person or group around the country who are kind of thinking about reentering. And one of the groups that I spent time with was a public high school in Virginia. And it was a group of administrators in Vienna, Virginia, Madison High School, where they were welcoming back, I think, 150 faculty members for the first time in 16 months. And I think, like so many communities, some had been there kind of all along because they were considered essential workers. Some didn't want to come back. I mean, a whole range. And what this group did for that first meeting back, that before the students came back, is that the building itself was under construction, which actually at first they worried about, and then they realized is a really powerful metaphor. And as faculty came, they handed out construction hats, and they literally said, like, "Welcome to the construction zone." And they had their teachers come and first just walk the hallways. And just literally, like, don't underestimate the power of just taking a breath and walking through, whether it's your offices and looking at the plants that have died that no one has tended to over the last 16 months, right? Pausing so that we actually remember physically in an embodied way what has transpired here. And then they invited they asked a number of different questions that teachers would stand and sit as they were able, if it was true for their experience. So, if you were worried about coming back, if you're thrilled to come back. And one of the things you begin to notice is we have inherent contradictions within ourselves, right? I could stand for I'm worried to come back, and I could stand I'm excited to come back. And they basically created like 2 or 3 hours to process in thoughtful ways the experiences that faculty had so that they can begin to think about that, so that they can then hold their students. And then the last thing they did was they put together like very simple paper and scissors and glue, and they invited them to build the school of the future. And it could be physically, we want a snack room, but it could also be psychologically and relationally. And it allowed the teachers to spend some time, again, processing. It's not rocket science. Processing, talking about, and then imagining and envisioning forward. What do we want to bring with us? What do we actually never want to do it again? And what might we invent now? And how do we do it in a way where we're looking at each other and we're doing this as part of a community, not just sort of an edict handed down from on high. And I think whether you're a group of friends, or whether you're a religious community or a community of faith, or whether you're a group of activists, or, fill in the blank, to pause and to create time and space and structure, a little bit of structure to think about and collectively process, again, through simple conversation. What have we been through? What have we learned? And what do we want to build now?
That is so beautiful. What a powerful example that you just shared. As we wrap this conversation, I just want to reflect on a couple of themes that you've lifted up, which I think are so powerful. One is this power of pausing, which seems so simple, but is not often easy to do in a fast-paced life, but so critical. I think the importance of reflecting, and here a little bit of structure can go a long way, just like you said, in helping create the space and the circumstances for people to share a little more deeply about what they truly want. And I think that there's a powerful theme here that both of you and I have touched on, which is, I think, the importance of recognizing that this is a moment to reevaluate our connection and commitment to one another. And that, this is a time where we've got to care for ourselves, but also care for others, but ask ourselves, what is our responsibility to one another beyond the people that we know? And then finally, to make sure that this is reflected, ultimately, these reflections and realizations in how we live our lives, in the decisions we make about how we treat people, but also in the issues we choose to use our voice to advocate for in the public square. If we use this moment, this pandemic, to build stronger connection, to come together more tightly as a community to build the structures, policies, and programs and practices in our institutions that will allow us to lift up everyone, recognizing we do go farther when we go together. And we will have found an incredibly powerful silver lining in this pandemic. And that's what I hope that we're able to do together over the months and years ahead. But Priya, thank you so much for this conversation, for everything you have contributed to the world through your writing, your speaking. You certainly inspired me over recent years, and I know you'll continue to do so for many folks down the line. So appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murthy, and thank you for your work and for using your position to elevate these conversations and making them super practical. So thank you for having me, and thank you to the 92nd Street Y for having us both.